I've used Synology Drive for years as my personal cloud, but I finally replaced it. After testing different options, I moved everything over to Nextcloud, and it's completely changed how I manage my files. Instead of relying on a vendor's ecosystem, I now have a fully private cloud that I control with the same syncing and sharing features I used to rely on. In this video, I'll walk you through how I set up Nextcloud as a private cloud, how to use Nextcloud, and how I set up remote access for not only myself, but eventually other team members. So the way we're going to set this up is inside of Docker, which I have currently running in Proxmox, and then we're going to mount and save all of the data for Nextcloud on a NAS. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I like to offload the computing resources required to Proxmox if I can, as opposed to running it directly on my NAS. This is the way that I like to do it, but if you wanted to, you could run this all on your NAS. So the very first thing to do to set up Nextcloud is actually make a few changes on our Docker instance, mainly so that we can mount folders directly inside of our Docker instance so that we know where Nextcloud will be writing that data. So I have a Docker folder inside of my home folder here, and this is where I'm going to be storing all of the data. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a directory for Nextcloud. We're going to be using the all-in-one installer, so that's what AIO stands for. And then we're going to create another directory for our Nextcloud data, and this is where our data will live. Now, while I want to run Nextcloud inside of Docker, I don't want to actually store the data inside of Docker. What I want to do is I want to store that data on a NAS somewhere. So I already have this installed, but you would have to run this command right here, and then it will go through and install the NFS tools that we'll need. So I'm using a test NAS device here, but realistically, this is going to work the same on any NAS operating system. You just kind of have to know how to set up an NFS share. So what I did is I created a folder here for Nextcloud, and then inside of the control panel, what I can do is go to that shared folder, edit it, open the NFS permissions, enable the NFS service if it's not, and then I can grant the permissions to the Docker host, which in this case is the IP address 10.2.1.212. I'm going to give read-write permissions, and I'm going to save this. So what this is going to allow us to do is basically connect directly to this NAS using the IP address through NFS, and then just write data to and from the NAS without having to authenticate. The authentication is done through that IP address. So what we can do at this point is go back to the Docker host, and then we can mount that folder. So this is the working directory here that we want to mount. So I'm going to save this. And then what I'm going to do is edit the fstab file. This is basically so that every single time this system boots, it will automatically connect to the NAS. And then I'm going to paste in this line here. And basically, this is just saying that this is the IP address of the NAS. This is the folder that we are connecting to. This is the folder that we want to mount the NAS to. We're using NFS, and then everything else is defaults. Now, a few things to note here is that volume 1, this section here, is going to be slightly different depending on the exact NAS operating system that you're using. So in my production environment, I'm using TrueNAS. It's a little different. I have to mount the Z pool, but just look up exactly how you have to do it, and then you'll be mounting it the same way. So we are going to write this out. And then what I like to do is just reboot the system, mainly because then we could test to make sure everything mounts up at boot. So with the system rebooted, what I did is access that folder. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a test file. And then on the NAS, if we open up File Station, you would see that we created that test file. So basically, it's connected to the NAS. Everything is working properly. So we can go in here and we can remove this file. And then at that point, we can start to set up Nextcloud. So inside of Portainer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Stacks, and then I'm going to add a new stack, and I'm just going to call this Nextcloud AIO. And then I'm going to paste in this Docker Compose file, and I will leave a link to that in the description. But the key thing here that you have to be aware of is this is the directory where we will be writing our Nextcloud data. So this is on our NAS. The other thing we're doing is we have to use, for the all-in-one installer, we have to use this volume name. So I'm mounting it directly to this folder location. That was the other directory that we created. This is not necessary due to how the all-in-one installer works, but I like to mount it. Everything else can stay as default. And again, I will have this in the description. So we are going to deploy this stack. And once the container is started, we can access port 8080, which is going to bring us to the all-in-one installer's configuration. And when we're there, it has a self-signed certificate, so we can proceed. Now, this passphrase is very important. If you ever have to access the all-in-one setup page again, this is what you'll use to access it. So make sure you save this somewhere. And then you can open the Nextcloud login page. You can paste that in, and then you can log in. So the all-in-one installer is a little different. And basically, by default, what it does is it wants you to use a reverse proxy server. Now, it's a little out of scope for this. Unfortunately, you do need it to set this up. But the reason I'm saying it's a little out of scope for this is because, one, there are a bunch of different reverse proxy servers you can use. Two, there are different ways that you could do it. So if you wanted to, you could expose the reverse proxy server to the world, and then at that point, Nextcloud will be accessible by the world. I don't want to do that. So what I do is I set up an internal reverse proxy server. I set it up using Nginx Proxy Manager. I have a video on it. That will be a complete setup for this. But basically what this allows me to do is it allows me to have a certificate for all of my services. So you'll see npm.home. This is a local DNS record that has a Let's Encrypt certificate. It's a wildcard certificate. That video goes over the entire thing. If you didn't want to do it this way, you can set up a regular old reverse proxy server and then set it up to use port forwarding, and then it would be accessible by the world. So this is how you could set up the reverse proxy if you wanted it exposed to the world. Basically, you would port forward port 443 to your reverse proxy server. You would set the name that you wanted to use on your domain registrar. You would have to create the DNS record, and then you would point it to the service. So the important point here is 10.2.1.212 is the IP address of Docker, and port 11,000 here is the port for the Apache web server that we're using to access Nextcloud. So that is very important. This is how it works for Nginx Proxy Manager. You'll see I basically have it set up the exact same way. The only difference is that I have a valid SSL certificate, which again is that wildcard certificate. So this is going to be the toughest part for most people. If you have a reverse proxy server, it's super easy. You just set up a new record. If you don't have a reverse proxy server, you'll have to go through and set one up. Again, I have a video on this. I would recommend that you follow that because it's a full setup that you're going to have to go through. Now, the last thing that I had to do is this nextcloud/aio.home. That's the domain name I want to use to access Nextcloud. What I had to do was set up a local DNS record. That was done right here. What you'll see is Nextcloud AIO points to npm.home, which is the IP address of my reverse proxy server. So again, if you are setting this up for public access, you will not do this portion. You would set up the reverse proxy server. You would set up a DNS record for it on your domain registrar, and it would be done that way. Watch that video. It'll walk you through the whole thing. So this right here is where I am going to enter in that domain name. And then when we submit it, we'll be able to set up Nextcloud. Now, something that's very important is if you were to be restoring a Nextcloud instance, you would do it directly from this section here, but we'll talk about that in a minute here. So I'm going to submit this domain, and then we'll be brought to the installer. So these options down here are what you can install. I'm going to uncheck Nextcloud Talk because I will not use it, and Whiteboard as well. You can install everything or nothing. It's up to you. I'm going to save those changes. And after I do, I can download and start the containers. Now, what this will do is this is going to run through, and it's basically going to download and install everything that is needed for Nextcloud. So basically, for every single one of these here, you are going to have a different container. Those containers are going to have different volumes. The reason why this is important is because when you traditionally set up a Docker container, normally you will bind it to a local folder. We did it for this as well, but it doesn't tell the whole story. That local folder will traditionally have the important data for the container. With Nextcloud all-in-one, you cannot do it that way. If you ever wanted to migrate this to a separate server, you can do it. But the difference is you have to export your containers and then you have to import them. So real quick, these, as you can see, are all created at this point. If I come back to Portainer here and I refresh this, what you'll see is we still only have one master container. But if we go into containers, you'll see we have all of these Nextcloud containers. If we go into volumes, you'll see we have all of these Nextcloud volumes. This is what's storing all of your important data. If you were to migrate this to another system, you would not migrate these volumes. What you would do is export your data and then import it in that initial setup step that we just did. So this is our admin user's password. We will open Nextcloud. You'll see that it will open directly to that domain name we set, and then we can log in with the admin user. Now, the first thing that I like to do is come into accounts and then basically just create a new account, set the user to be part of the admin group, add this account, log out as the admin user, log in as my user, then go back to accounts and then disable the admin user. Has a secure password. You don't have to do this, but I like to get off the default values. So at this point, Nextcloud is actually set up. So if we come in here, you'll see that we have all of this data here. If we go back to our NAS, you will see we have data in this directory as well. So this is my Frank user account, and inside of my files here, I have all of my data. So the reason I like to do this is because then on whatever NAS operating system I'm using, I can go inside and set up snapshots for this folder. So I can set up automatic snapshots to run either daily or hourly if you really wanted to. It's kind of up to you however you want to do it. Enable a retention policy, and then at that point, I will have snapshots for my Nextcloud data. So the container is running in Docker, but the data lives on the NAS. That's exactly what I want. So from this web interface here, you can kind of do everything that you need to do. This will store all of your documents, and if you need to, you can access them from wherever you are on your local network using this specific domain name that we set up earlier. Now, the one thing I've always used in Synology Drive is a feature called On-Demand Sync. And basically what it does is it syncs data from whatever device I'm currently on to my NAS. I install that sync tool on all of my applications, and then I have up-to-date information using on-demand sync. This will all make sense in a second here. This is the biggest feature that I had a hard time replacing, but Nextcloud has done a great job, and overall it's worked very well. So we're going to quickly set that up. So on the Nextcloud website, basically I just went to the Nextcloud files section here, and I downloaded and installed the Windows version. And after you do that, you will be brought to this section here, which is the Nextcloud Setup. So after selecting Login, I can enter the domain name. We can select Next, and then it's going to ask me to log in. So after I log in, I can grant access, and then at that point, we will be logged in. So I'm actually going to skip this because I want to show you how it would look traditionally. But after accessing the settings, you can see what we can do here. So what I'm going to do is add a folder sync connection. Then I'm going to pick a directory. So I'm just going to select the Nextcloud Documents folder that I just created. So after selecting the location, we're going to select Next. And this is where you can determine what you'd like to sync. So I'm going to sync documents, click Next, and then this use virtual file. So I keep calling it on-demand sync. That's kind of what I've always known it as, but it's really virtual files. I'll show you how it works, but the idea is that you're not actually syncing all of the data to your local device. You're only syncing references to that data. So then what I'm going to do is add that sync connection. And now if we open this folder, what you'll see is that we're basically matching the data on our local folder with the data in Nextcloud. Now, the way that this works is that if you double click this, it will automatically download the file and it will ask you where to open it. And then it basically works the same way as you'd expect. The only difference is that the status now shows as it's on this device. And I basically have a few options here. So I can make it always available locally, which basically just says anytime this file changes on the server, so in this case on Nextcloud, automatically download those changes locally. Or if it's a big file, I'm working on it and I don't want to store it anymore, I can select this free up local space option and it will change from a green check mark to a cloud again, which in essence means that it's now stored in Nextcloud, but is not stored locally. This feature is super, super important to me. And as soon as you start to use it, you will see the value in it. The other very valuable portion of Nextcloud is their apps. So inside of their app store here, you will see a bunch of different applications that you can download and install. They're very different and they're very user specific. So depending on what you want to do, that will ultimately determine what you're going to download. So if you're using a local reverse proxy server like I am, as of right now, Nextcloud is only accessible locally. So I had to start thinking about how I wanted to access this externally, because the idea here, or the overall goal here, is to eventually have external users access this Nextcloud server with access to specific files. But for me, I didn't want to expose this to the world. So when I started to look at my requirements, I really wanted something that's user-friendly, easy to use, reliable, and that's when I decided on Twingate, the sponsor of today's video. I've used Twingate in the past. It has worked very, very well, and it's going to do exactly what we need here. So in order to get to that step, we have to download and configure Twingate. And this right here is the admin console for Twingate. The only thing I've done up to this point is select a name. I will be using WunderTech.Twingate. So the first thing that I need to do is basically set up a resource so that I can access my data locally. Now, the first question a lot of people are going to have is, why don't you just use a VPN? And a VPN is a great option if you're an individual user. But for me, I need external users to access this. And I don't want to create external VPN access and limit it down using the firewall. While I can do that overall, this is a better way of doing it, because then I can specify exact resources that these users will be able to access inside of Twingate, and on my internal firewall side, I'll be able to limit it down as well. We're going to take a look at that in a second here. So what we're going to do is set up access to my home network. So inside of this resource section here, I'm just going to select on-premise, and then I'm going to call it home network, and I'm going to add my remote network. It's going to ask me to add a resource. We're not going to do that just yet. So inside of this home network resource here, we need to deploy a connector. Now, what's nice about this is they actually have two different connectors here, and you can do this for redundancy purposes. So in a perfect world, you would have this set up on two separate devices on your home network. So if one of them goes down, you'll still have a way to access your local network. I'm just going to deploy one of them right now, but I'm going to select deploy connector, and then you have to determine what you'd like to use. For me, I want this to all run inside of a Linux container on my Proxmox host. So I'm going to select Linux. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to generate my tokens. I will have to authenticate to do that. And after I do that, I am going to copy this command here. So on my Proxmox host here, what I'm going to do is create a new Linux container. I'm going to give it the host name LXC Twingate. I'm going to give it the ID 162. And then in the template section here, I'm going to use Ubuntu. Select my virtual machine storage. 8 gigs is fine. 1 core is fine. Update this to 1 gig of memory. And then for here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the VLAN tag 240. This is for my development VLAN. I have this set up in my production environment, but I'm just showing you how I set it up here. So 240 is going to set it to be on a separate VLAN than my Nextcloud host. And I'll explain why in a second here. We're going to set IPv4 to DHCP. Everything else can stay as default, and then we're going to start it up. So once it's ready, you're going to see that it has a 10.2.40 IP address. That's from my development VLAN. My Nextcloud host is on 10.2.1, that subnet. So I'm going to update the system and then upgrade it. And once the system is done updating, we are going to install curl because the installer will need that. And then we can paste in that command and it will run through and automatically install Twingate. And now once it's done, you will see that we are connected on the Twingate side. So again, in the home network side, it'll show as yellow because I only set up one of these, but if you wanted to, you could set up a second, which would allow you to have redundancy for both of them. Really cool feature. So now that that's done, what we need to do is create a resource. And this is where things get interesting. So what we want to do is we want to be able to access Nextcloud, but I don't want anybody to be able to access anything else. And for that reason, we're going to do this a little differently than you've probably seen in the past. So we're going to add a resource. We're going to call it Nextcloud AIO. And then in the address here, we're going to use that same domain name that we used before. Now at this point, if you wanted to, you could limit it down to specific ports. Doesn't really matter because of what we're going to do on the firewall side here. But what you'll see is that this right here, as soon as it's done, will allow us to access Nextcloud when we're connected to Twingate. So we're going to create that resource. We're going to select this for everyone. We will grant access. And then our first resource is created. Now in the team section here, I added myself, and then I created another account for myself as well. And that's what I'm going to quickly do. So I'm going to switch to a device that does not have access to my local network, and we're going to see how this works. So if I try and access Nextcloud here, what you'll see is that it doesn't work. And the reason is because I'm not connected to Twingate. So in the bottom here, you'll see authenticate to continue. So Twingate is smart enough to know that it has an entry for Nextcloud inside of it. And if I authenticate, I should be able to access that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to authenticate, and you'll see that I am now connected to it. And if we refresh this page here, it's still not going to work. And there's a very specific reason why. So most users' biggest concern with Zero Trust networks is that they have access to everything, meaning that if the management console was to be taken over for whatever reason, if there was a security vulnerability, you have unrestricted access to the local network. You can access whatever you want. But if we pair that with a local firewall, that's not the case. And the truth is, the industry, from a global IT perspective, is generally trending towards Zero Trust networks because with a VPN, you traditionally have access to everything. And with Zero Trust networking, you don't. You only have access to whatever your user account has access to. And then at that point, you can actually have different user accounts have access to different things, not necessarily everything, which a lot of clients I work with are always complaining about. So how can we fix this? On my firewall here, what you'll see is I have a rule here that says block development to trusted/management. Now remember, that connector that we created is on our development VLAN. So by default, that traffic is being blocked. So what can we do? In order to pass that, what we can do is we can allow it to access our Nginx Proxy Manager server on port 443 and nothing else. So this rule right here, all it's saying is 10.2.40.91, which is the IP address of that Linux container, is allowed to access 10.2.1.215, which is where my Nginx Proxy Manager server is hosted, on the Nginx Proxy Manager ports, which are 80 and 443. So I just created a new list here and I added 80 and 443 the same way here, gave it a name, and that's what you see here. So if we apply these changes and then we go back, if we refresh this, you will see that we can access it. So we actually have two layers of control here. The first is on the Twingate side. We only allowed this one domain. And what's cool about it is that I have other things hosted as well. So I have my production instance is nextcloud.home. I can't access it because in Twingate, all I did was allow that one domain name. If I wanted to now, if I have multiple team members, I could go in and I could say certain team members can access certain domain names. That's the power of using Twingate with a local firewall. You can limit exactly what it can and cannot access. Now, your next question is going to be, if for whatever reason there was a security vulnerability in Twingate, wouldn't they be able to go in and just create resources for all of your services? And yes, that is true. But one, they would need to know the exact domain name, so you have some security through obscurity there. And two, if you really wanted to, if you were really that concerned, you could go through and basically set up a second reverse proxy server for all of your shared resources and then one for all of your local resources. And then at that point, no one would be able to access anything. Now, I want to be clear that I don't view that as a major concern. I don't have any major concerns that Twingate or any other Zero Trust network provider are going to be compromised and have unrestricted access from that perspective to your local network. But there's nothing wrong with implementing some security controls to ensure that those services or those people can only access the exact things that you specify. That is something that Zero Trust networks simply do better than traditional VPNs. And in this case, it is the perfect option because I will have people that I don't know accessing my services. I don't want to add them to my VPN. And some of them should be able to access certain things, and some of them should be able to access other things. Twingate will allow me to do just that. So I hope you got some value out of this. This was a very, very long tutorial, but overall, it shows you the complete setup for Nextcloud. It shows you exactly how I am using it in my current environment. And overall, for the short time that I've run it, it's run very well, and it has completely replaced Synology Drive for me, which is the last service that I've been wanting to replace. So again, hope you got some value out of this. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments. But other than that, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Twingate for sponsoring this video. I'll see you guys next time.